Well. Okay. Well, let's get going. I hope last week you enjoyed our time in Daniel. I think it was a very interesting book. So much there. We only could touch on the surface of things, but I wanted to continue in our exploration in our study of key passages in eschatology, those passages which provide uh, detail and understanding to help us with knowing better what is coming and what God has planned in His redemptive uh, program. Um, and again, yeah, last week our focus was Daniel 7 or 9, excuse me, 24 to 27. And as we discussed last time, it dealt with Daniel's 77s. And I like to use the term sevens rather than weeks because one, that's the more literal translation of the word. It's seven, and also two. It when you say weeks, it sort of can imply a period of time as a week, but really it's 77s. And as we discussed in the context there, those 77s are linked to the 70 years that uh, that the Jews had suffered in Babylon in exile, and Daniel then, at the end of those 70 years, offered up prayer that God would keep his promise to deliver them from exile, to show mercy. And so Gabriel is sent and tells Daniel of another 77s that would transpire, and 70 periods of 7 years each. And then he foretells of the 69 sevens that would take place between Jerusalem and the cutting off of Messiah the Prince, and then jumps ahead and tells of the 70th seven, the last seven, and what would take place in that, the abomination of desolation. And then we briefly touched on after that Daniel 11 and 12, which really, if you look at it, Daniel, the rest of Daniel after chapter 9 sort of fills in more details of the 69 sevens. Because if you look at Daniel 11, verse 1, and I'll ask Manny to read this. Could you read this, Daniel 11, verses 1 to 4?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Thank you.
Daniel 11, verses 1 to 4. Now I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to strengthen and to be a fortress for him. So now I will tell you the truth. Behold, three more kings are going to stand in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the kingdom of Greece, and a mighty king will stand, and he will dominate with great domination and to and do as he pleases. But as soon as he stands, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out towards the four winds of heaven, but now to his own descendants, nor according, but not to his own descendants, nor according to his domination with which he dominated. For his kingdom will be uprooted and given to others besides them.
Okay, so um, what we see here is in the first year of Darius the
Yes,
Mede, and again,
there's earthquake here. There's
remember,
earthquake here.
Darius the Mede is the one appointed by Cyrus. Remember, for Cyrus was king when Persia came and defeated Babylon. Remember Daniel chapter 5, hand on the wall, writing, and
There's a there's earthquake.
predicted the defeat of Babylon by the Persians. And remember, the Persians also incorporated the Medes as well. And so apparently Cyrus, as Second Chronicles 36 tells us, Cyrus was the ruler when the Persians took over Babylon, and he appointed Darius because earlier in Daniel it says Darius was who was made king of Babylon. And so in that first year of Darius, which was the first year of the Persian rule, notice Daniel foretells that 3 more kings were going to rise up after Cyrus. And of course, after Cyrus died, then came, we have extra biblical records following Cyrus. His son, Cambyses, I think is his name, reigned. And we have extra biblical records that says Cyrus reigned from about 536 or so until 530. And then Cyrus died. And then the extra biblical accounts tell us that his son, Cambyses reigned for about 5 years until 522. And then came Darius. He reigned from about 522 to 486 or so BC, something like that. So that was the string. But notice he says 3 more kings will stand in Persia after Cyrus. I don't remember who comes after Darius. I think it's is it Xerxes or Artaxerxes? I can't remember. And then he's followed by I think it's Artaxerxes. I don't remember. I think Xerxes is Ahasuerus and Esther. I remember right. I didn't study up on my Persian kings before our time today, but I'm trying to remember. But in any case, so there's a string of kings mentioned. So he's starting here from the first year of the Persian rule. And he predicts there will be several more kings to come. And then another king will rise up and he will seek to fight Greece. And then a mighty king of Greece will stand and will dominate. And of course, we know now that mighty king was Alexander the Great. But as soon as he stands, that is this mighty king of Greece, his kingdom, this mighty king's kingdom, will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. So it actually will split up into 4 separate pieces. But not to his own descendants, nor according to his domination. His kingdom will be uprooted and given to others besides them. All right. So, of course, we can look from this side and look back and see, these prophecies were fulfilled exactly. So exact, so correct that many modern scholars dispute that Daniel wrote this, but said, no, someone else wrote this after it happened because this is too accurate. But the reason I bring this up is, of course, in Daniel's time, he wouldn't have known any of these kings' names, right? This Darius or Xerxes, Artaxerxes, or Alexander the Great. Okay, so when we interpret this passage, just as we did for Daniel 9, you need to try to understand it and interpret it from the perspective of the author, rather than what often happens with prophetic books is with prophecies is the interpreter will just automatically start from looking at it backwards. So from, oftentimes you may hear a sermon on Daniel 11 and he'll just talk about, which kings they were and Alexander the Great and the fulfillment of the prophecy, rather than first, I think, okay, let's look at it from Daniel's viewpoint and what his purpose was in giving this prophecy, just like we talked about last week. You want to first understand, because Daniel wouldn't have known all those details. His audience wouldn't have known all those details. They didn't. Alexander the Great was 200 years in the future, so he wasn't even a thought as far as any of the people were concerned. Of course, God knew about him, but his name isn't mentioned here, only that a mighty king will rise up. And so all of these details are described, all of these details are given, but we have to think about again, the most important question of the exegete is, why is this here? What was the author trying to accomplish by giving this particular message? What is it? Why does he explain it as well in so great a detail? And he's talking here, and as you continue on in the chapter, Daniel continues to describe what's going to happen to those four kingdoms, and how a king of the north and the king of the south will rise up and compete with each other, and then the king of the north will commit an abomination of desolation, and all of these things are mentioned, great detail of future events. And now, again, we can look back and say, oh, those events cover from the time of the first year of the Persian rule into the Persian kings, into the king of Greece, into all the way in through the Maccabean period in the time of Israel, around 160 something BC. But rather than try to just fill in, okay, how was the prophecy fulfilled? We first need to think, oh, okay, what is Daniel wanting to do here? What is his purpose? Why is he writing about these things? Or better yet, what is it the Holy Spirit wanted the original audience to understand from these messages? And I think first, as we think about it in the context of the book, it's important to remember, okay, at the end of Daniel 9, Daniel's given these 77s, right? And it's divided up between the 69 sevens and then the 70th seven. And again, we know looking back, we can fill in the details, but Daniel could not have done that at the time that he had that. He would just know that there would be these 69 sevens between the rebuilding of Jerusalem until the Messiah is cut off. And then I think, as you think about then, Daniel, the chapters which follow that, I think Daniel is filling in some of the details within those 69 sevens. What's going to happen from his time period into Israel's history? And so I think he's giving us some detail, or giving the original audience some detail as to the events which will take place in the Persian kingdom, followed by the kingdom of Greece. And then, he doesn't get to Rome. Rome comes up, in the New Testament. But this is sort of really the only biblical account we're given of that time period, from really the days of Malachi, that period of silence, that 400-year silence where no prophet speaks between Malachi and John the Baptist. Well, here we're actually given a biblical account of events regarding Israel that happen or are going to happen in that time period. So I think Daniel is really just filling in some of those details for his readers to see. Now, let me ask you guys a question, see what you think. Why do you think Daniel does this? What would be, do you think, Daniel's purpose for the reader? What does he want the reader of his book to gain from giving us this detailed history in Daniel chapter 11? Well, history for us is detailed future events. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Maybe Pastor Tim to show his readers that God is sovereign over everything, over their exile, and God has, just like what he said to Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and to give you hope and a future. He's showing them that God is totally in control.
How would that connect to the theme of or focus of the book of Daniel? Do you know that what's the theme of Daniel, the book as a whole? Anybody remember the book overall?
Um, God sets up kings and removes kings. God is uh, I forgot the term, but I think that's it, Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it's connected to what you said earlier, Harris, because I think you're exactly right that Daniel 9 or 11 is given to show, God's demonstrating his sovereignty by saying, look, these are the specific details, these are the events that are going to happen. And that really demonstrates his control. And that's connected to the theme of the book, in that Daniel is all about God's sovereignty over the nations and that he will establish his kingdom through his king. And so if you look at each chapter in Daniel, it's really centered around that theme of God's sovereignty over the nations. And so I think he is simply continuing that theme, showing that you remember in Daniel 2, the statue, gold head, Babylon, the silver chest is Persia, the bronze loins are Greece, and then you had the legs of iron, Rome, the four kingdoms, and then the stone that crushes the kingdoms, and then Daniel declares, right, it's God's kingdom is will rule over the others. And Daniel 7, the four beasts that again represent those four kingdoms and how the Messiah will reign. And then if you look at the other chapters, they're just all examples of God's sovereign hand over the kings and the nations of the earth. And so, yeah, I think we have to look at Daniel 11 in light of the purpose of the book, the theme of the book, that that God's just continuing to show in each chapter his sovereign hand over the nations. And this would have been important because remember, Daniel's written this book sometime probably right after the exile. The last events described, or the last time mentioned in Daniel, I think is in Daniel 10. Yes, Daniel chapter 10, Daniel mentions, he says, in the third year, you can see that here, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So that's the latest date mentioned in the book. Um, and so Daniel probably wrote not long after that, because by this time, Daniel would have likely been in his 90s or close to 90 years old. And he certainly is the author of the book. Notice I, Daniel, in the first person. So these events were written to the people who were just coming out of the exile. And so the original audience would have been given these stories and these accounts and these details of future events, certainly to reinforce, look, we've gone through exile, but God has not forgotten us. He's still in control. Look at all these examples of how he raised up the Babylonians and then he took them down. He raised up the Persians, he took them down. He's going to raise up Greece and then take Greece down. And that's what chapter 11 shows us. And so it's just that continuing theme and evidence of God's hand, not only over the nations, but even over the kings of the nations. We see that in Daniel chapter 4 when he brings down Nebuchadnezzar, right? Makes him eat grass. We see it in Daniel 5 when he shows Belshazzar that his kingdom is going to end, that he's going to end. And so each chapter really is just reinforcing this particular theme. And then Daniel ends the book with these uh, prophecies regarding the time within the silent period, during the period of the 69 sevens, or at least um, a portion of that period, the 69 sevens. And then Daniel 12, he jumps to, we can see it here in Daniel 12, he jumps ahead to the end times, to the tribulation. Really the last half, because notice he says, from the time of the regular sacrifices abolished, that refers back to Daniel 9. If you remember from last week, right? Daniel 9, 27, where it says, he, that is the prince of the people, will make a firm covenant with the people of Israel for 1 week, 1/7. But in the middle of the 7, he will make sacrifice and grain offering cease. And on the wing of abomination will come one who makes desolate, even a complete destruction. Well, I think that's what he's referring to at the very end in Daniel 12, when he talks about, in verse 11, from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Remember, on the lunar calendar, 1 year is 360 days. And so 3.5 years would be, is that 1,260 days? Do I get that right? Did my math right? That's 360. Harris, help me out. You've been an engineer sooner than I have. So 720, 10, 1180 plus 180. Yeah, 1,260. Okay.
It's 12.
Thank you. Tabs, you used a calculator. That's why you hid your video. Yeah, I see that calculator. Okay, so here, from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished, and remember, when was that going to happen? Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the 7, right? So in the middle of that last 7, 1,260 days, the abomination of desolation. And then there will be 1,290 days after that. So another 3.5 years plus 1 month. From the time the regular sacrifice, the abomination of desolation is set up, from that time to the end, it's 1,290 days. And then Daniel mentions there's another 45 days after that. Now, we're not told what goes on in those. We have to fill that in from other books, but that's not the important thing here. The important thing here is to recognize, again, Daniel jumps from this time period in the 69 sevens, in the period of silence. He jumps from there to the end, to the last half of the last 7, and describes that then the end will come. And then he ends the book on that note. And so, again, I think Daniel is just trying, he's filling in information and quite a bit of detail in parts of history that will follow the rule of the Persian Empire. And then again, jumping ahead to the second coming. Now, he doesn't mention the first and second coming here. But he does talk about events that surround that time. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, others to reproach, everlasting contempt. What does that sound like? Yeah. Bodily resurrection in the Old Testament. Those who have insight will shine brightly. Star Sun. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words, seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, 2 others were standing. And so, again, Daniel just relays these events to us. So that's really, again, some interesting, important details that Daniel provides. But always look first as to, before we start trying to fill in and bring in other passages and start preaching this as an eschatology session, let's remember first, all right, what are the events he describes, and how would those be understood by Daniel's original audience, and how do they connect to what the point that Daniel's trying to make in the book? Do that first, and then certainly you can say, now we know this part's been fulfilled, as we, and you can give that instruction as well, but I would encourage you not to jump to that first if you're teaching through the passage. That's the same, we've talked about this principle when preaching like narratives, right? To tell the story first and the point of the story before looking at some doctrines that you see in the story. Um, Nothing wrong with identifying those doctrines and teaching on those doctrines that are seen in the story. That's perfectly fine to do, but I think it's best to teach the story and the author's point of the story first, and then you can come back around and uncover some doctrines that are seen within the account. To me, that's you first want to, because remember, in the narratives aren't often given so that as a systematic theology, right? Just like these end time events, these prophecies are not given just as a lesson in eschatology. It's given to address a particular issue that the author wants to speak about, that the author wants to focus on. He has a purpose, right? In bringing and writing this book and putting the things that he puts in the book and the order that he puts those things. That's true for narratives. It's true for prophetic books. Any book is like that. So that's what we want to uncover first is, all right, what's the author want us to see here? What's his main point? What's his focus? That's the Holy Spirit inspired um, meaning of the text, and then, following that, certainly we can look at things that we learn from the passage as well. And so I would say for narratives, right, teach the narrative first, the point of the narrative, the author's point, and then you can go back and cover other aspects that you think will be important for your congregation. The same with prophecy, just teach the meaning, the prophecy first and what it would mean to that original audience before you jump to interpreting it, the eschatology, that things we learn eschatologically. Okay. All right. I'm just reinforcing what you already know. We've already discussed before in times past, but I just want to keep this as a point of emphasis for us. Authorial intent drives us as we interpret the text, to understand the exegete, to understand the original author's meaning to his audience. And then from there, we can branch out to, okay, how does it apply to us today? But part of that application to us today would be, okay, like Harris mentioned for Daniel 11, here this demonstrates the sovereignty of God and that he can predict precisely particular details. Therefore, he must be sovereign in order to ensure that those details, that it happens that way, right? Um, if God was not sovereign, he could not guarantee these events, could he? Well, unless you're a theoretical physicist and you talk about, the ability to bend time and, look in the future. And, of course, God can do that, but he controls the future. So anyway, any thoughts or questions, comments about this before we jump to Zechariah?
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Pastor Kim. Thank you very much. That oftentimes we are tempted to already interpret the passage in our own um, setting, but yeah, the reminder that we should grasp the text first in their own tongue, and then only after we grasp the text in our own tongue, we translate we move to that particular stage.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's always the safest route, honestly. Um, figure out what the author's doing, the significance of the passage to his hearers, and then the timeless truths connected to that. And then how does that apply to us? And then of course, if you want to get into the details of how the prophecy was fulfilled and that how that in this case in Daniel 11, I would do that. Once I've talked about, okay, what's the general flow here? Um, what does Daniel reveal here? How does this connect to the book? How does it connect to what he said before? And then as you describe, okay, and all the events here in Daniel 11 have been fulfilled. And as you describe um, historically how they fulfill that, that'll only reinforce even more the theme of God's sovereignty. Say, look, this is exactly how it happens. God, God foretold it precisely. Um, and that even would more reinforce this theme of God's sovereign hand in the nations of the earth and how he works. Okay, good. Any other comments, thoughts, or questions? All right, let's dive into one of my favorite chapters in um, in one of my favorite Old Testament books, which is Zechariah. Zechariah 14, the last chapter of Zechariah. Um, this is a really fun chapter. In fact, I still remember when I was a new Christian, young Christian in college. I remember one of the professors from the Master's Seminary visiting our Bible study, and he preached on Zechariah 14. I don't remember a lot of the details, but I do remember his title, the the death knell of amillennialism. um, and the more I've studied this chapter, the more I would agree with him that really, as you go through this chapter, it's really, really difficult for someone who does not believe in the millennial kingdom. This chapter poses many problems, very difficult to interpret if you are assuming that there's no literal kingdom, millennial kingdom in the future. And so I wanted to look at this chapter because, again, one, it has much detail and gives us sort of a chronological sequence of future events. But also, two, just to reinforce my conviction, I believe what the Bible teaches regarding uh, the kingdom of the Messiah and how just taking a natural, literal, normal, interpretive approach to this chapter, not presuming symbols and figurative language and all of this, spiritualizing the text, just taking it at its face value, interpreting it in a normal way, like we do other passages, how I think it's very clear what uh, what is to come about. All right, so that said, let's jump in. All right, Jason, could you go ahead and read? Let's read the first four verses here from Zechariah 14, and then we'll make some observations.
Okay, Pastor. Zechariah 14, verse 1 to 4. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, and the women ravished, and the half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. And the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fights on the day of battle. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south.
Okay, so let's stop there for a moment. And and make some observations. All right, notice what's the first word here? Uh, behold, right? Hina. Uh, okay, stop now, listen up, right? It's the idea. And what is it that he's going to talk about? What's the next
A
sentence
day.
there? A day is coming. All right, so he's speaking of future event. Day is coming for Yahweh when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be captured, plundered, exiled. Right now, again, remember, when is Zechariah writing this? Is this before or after or during the Babylonian exile?
After, Pastor Tim.
It's after, correct. Probably several years later by this time. So, right? They just got back to the land, rebuilt the temple. They're just getting their lives back together. Maybe, built their houses and, trying to establish themselves. It's been maybe, 30 years, something like that, since they've been come back, or at least the first people come back from the exile. And now Zechariah is saying, okay, a day's coming when Jerusalem's going to get wiped out again. All the nations are going to gather around, right? So, that's great, Zechariah. Thank you very much. We're so excited to hear about this wonderful event coming. All right. So, verse 2 is not the happy news. Okay. Again, put yourself. This is what we need to do, right? Put ourselves in the shoes. Put ourselves uh, in the perspective of Zechariah's first audience, right? And they're reading this, and they've just come out of, at least within the last generation, and now they're being told it's going to happen again. This time, all the nations, not just Babylon, everybody's going to gather around us. But then, verse 3, what does it say there? Then Yahweh will go forth and fight against those nations as the day when he fights in the day of battle. Okay, now that's good. All right. So he's going to Yahweh himself, notice, will go forth and fight against those nations. And what does verse 4 tell us? Very interesting statement. Anybody? What is described here in verse 4?
The second coming, Pastor Tim, of the Lord
Okay,
Jesus
don't
Christ.
jump yet. Don't jump. But
Okay.
yes, you're right. But let's just look at it from in the passage itself. In that day, his feet. Who is the his?
Yahweh, Yahweh.
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 Yahweh's feet. Wait a minute. Hold on, Zechariah. Yahweh. How can Yahweh have feet?
Yeah.
So Yahweh's feet will stand, and notice a particular location on the Mount of Olives. So the implication is, picture the scene. And again, there's nothing here that says this is spiritualized or figurative yet, right? There's Jerusalem, literal Jerusalem, the nations, literal nations gathered around Jerusalem. They're going to attack the city, and then Yahweh will fight those nations. And he will come down, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and he will fight. Again, very specific. Mount of Olives in front of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives will be split. So that's the very specific location just outside the temple on the eastern side of Jerusalem. So, and then with that be this upheaval of the earth, this splitting of the mountain there. It's really not a huge mountain. It's like a big hill that will be split by the Lord as his feet slam down onto the earth. But one question that should hit us right away is, what do we mean feet here? How can Yahweh have feet? Okay, that's the thing that should pop out to us here. Um, Again, the nearest reference is Yahweh in verse, or the Lord, or Yahweh in verse 3. So it is referring to the Yahweh. That's how the New American Standard interpreted. They capitalized his, so they see that as the obvious. Um, and so before the cross, right? Many would have thought this passage may be figurative. That just speaking of his presence. That his presence will be at the Mount of Olives, and that will be true. He will be present in the Mount of Olives, but here it seems to be that he will have physical form, that his feet will stand. Now, again, as Harris said, post-cross, we can look back and we know exactly what this is, right? What event is this describing? Is this event mentioned in the New Testament, um, or alluded to, referred to, predicted?
Yeah, in Acts, Pastor Tim, when Jesus Christ ascended, the angel said he will come in the same manner
Yes.
when in which he left.
Yeah, you want to read that? Acts 1, 9 to 11. It's right here.
Yeah, Acts 1, 9 to 11. And after he had said these things, he was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky, while he was going, behold, two men in white clothing stood beside them. He also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking toward heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven.
So, yes, they are at the Mount of Olives, right? Uh, yeah, oh, sorry, here, verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem. So that's where they were. Jesus rises up from the Mount of Olives, and then the two angels tell them Jesus is going to come back in the same way, and they meant that literally. He went up in a cloud from the Mount of Olives. He's going to return from the clouds back down to the Mount of Olives. And so this just reinforces what is said here is literal. This is a literal prophecy. Okay. Now, again, uh, people in Zechariah's day, Zechariah would not, know about the ascension from the Mount of Olives at that point. But certainly, if they just took a normal literal understanding, they would say, you know what, God's going to fight our battles. He's going to come down, stand on the Mount of Olives, and fight against the nations who surrounded Jerusalem. All right. Then we come to verses 5 to 8. Atong, I'm going to ask if you could read these for us. Zechariah 14, verses 5 through 8.
Yes, Pastor.
Thank you.
You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. In that day there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light. And in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter.
Okay, so these events here described in verses 5 to 8, what are they referring to? We go back to verses 1 to 4. It's that day that is coming, right? And so he summarizes right after this upheaval when his feet land on the earth, when he stands in the Mount of Olives, and then they says you will flee in that day, right? Because it makes sense. Um, you have this attacking army of the nations that come in and plunder Jerusalem, and then the Lord arrives and the earth is upheaved. So this, it's going to be a scary time. And notice it says, then Yahweh, my God, will come. And look at that, all the holy ones with him. Boy, this is sure sounding like something familiar, isn't it? All right. And in that day, no light, luminaries will dwindle, it'll be a unique day, which is known to Yahweh. So it's just describing, this is quite a huge event in Israel's history. Again, we're speaking of Israel here, Jerusalem, the Jews. Notice, how do we know that for sure? Well, let me do this. Uh, I will gather the nations against whom? Jerusalem. Um, the nations surround Jerusalem. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives in front of Jerusalem. You will flee by the valley of my mountains. You will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. Who is the you here? Jews, right? Then Yahweh, my God, will come, all the ones with him. In that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the eastern sea. That's the sea, the Dead Sea, and the other half towards the western sea. That's the Mediterranean. Okay, so nothing in this point is speaking of in a figurative sense. We could take this literally, and it's focused, the attention here is centered around the people of Israel, Jerusalem in particular, right? If it's not literally Jerusalem, then what's he talking about here? And this is why, if you don't believe in a literal kingdom, this really presents some challenges of what's going on here. Like, what is Jerusalem then? And why does he reference this historical event, the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah? And why does he refer to a specific location in Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives? Why does he speak to them as you will flee, for the valiant will reach Azel. You will flee just as you fled before the earthquake, the days of Uzziah. So again, if this is some other people, not the people of Israel, then who are these people? Right? How do we interpret this if we don't take it literally? You see the challenge? So, and again, there's nothing here that suggests a non-literal approach should be taken or that this is symbolic. Because remember, with symbols, the text often reveals, gives clues or states directly the meaning of those symbols, and particularly in Zechariah, in those visions. They're all explained and the symbols are all recognized and explained. So it'd be rather odd for Zechariah to then have this symbolic, spiritualized, figurative language here at the end and not explain any of it. It's a literal event that's taking place. Comments or questions about that? Does that make sense? Or is that confusing? Or do you have any?
Yes, Pastor Tim. That I remember that's probably the reason why Martin Luther, when he came to Zechariah 14, he said, I give up.
Yeah,
I don't know what the prophet is talking about.
yeah, yeah. Did I mention that in class before, or did you read that somewhere?
I read somewhere positive.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if yeah.
Yeah, I do mention that. I just don't remember where I've said it when. But yeah, exactly. The first time Martin Luther did a commentary on Zechariah 14, he did not write anything, but simply said, of what the prophet speaks, I have no idea. And then that was it. And because he was looking at it from a spiritualized allegorical sense at that time. Later on, he did, I think in his second time that he went through, he did write a commentary on this chapter, but he took a sort of a spiritualized approach. I don't remember what he said or how he interpreted this, but yeah, this chapter presents some challenges if you do not take a literal approach. That's why the seminary professor called it the death knell of millennialism. But yeah, we won't have time to go into all the details and the specifics and the meaning here, but I just wanted you to see the general sense of Zechariah here is predicting literal events, literal locations that are going to take place in in the future. Now, he doesn't say when, he doesn't give detailed timeline like Daniel did, but we do get a sense this is the end because of what comes in verses 9 and following. Take a look with me, Zechariah 14, 9 and following. Tabs, can you read this section? This is 9 through 13.
Yes, Pastor. Zechariah 14, 9 to 13. The Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its side from Benjamin's gate as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. People will live in it, and there will be no longer a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouth. It will come about that in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one will be lifted against the hand of another.
All right. So a lot of detail here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but again, what's the summary statement here in verse 9? As a result so following the events, verses 1 to 8,
The Lord will be king over all the earth.
Yahweh will be king, right? Yahweh will be king over all the earth. King over all the earth. He's going to be what? King. Where? Over all the earth. In that day, what day? Well, the day he just described in verses 1 through 8, right? That's the near context. In that day, Yahweh will be the only one, his name the only one. Ah, so all his enemies have been dealt with. He's the one reigning over all the earth. And then, of course, here, verse 10 goes into more detail of, of the earth being upheaved. And again, notice specific names here. Plain from Geba to Ramon, south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site. Benjamin Gate, that's a specific location. The first gate, the corner gate, the Tower of Hananel. These are specific places in Jerusalem. Again, literal, right? Otherwise, what do these things mean? And what's Zechariah talking about? If these all represent something else, No, he's speaking of this is what's going to happen in the land, in Jerusalem. This is going to rise up. This is going to happen to these various places. People will live in it. There will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. Yeah, because Yahweh's king over all the earth. And notice he's going to describe the location where he is specifically reigning. We'll get to that in a minute. Um, okay, so God, Yahweh will deal with all of his enemies in that day. Notice verse 12, this their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their socket. Their tongue will rot in their mouth. That's pretty graphic. It's going to be pretty devastating destruction by Yahweh in that day. Okay? So we see this emphasis here as God comes, as he fights for Jerusalem against the nations. There's going to be chaos. They're fighting each other. The flesh will rot. I mean, it's gonna be a horrific uh, devastation upon God's enemies, and Yahweh will be king over all the earth in that day. He will reign supreme. And then notice what follows here. All right, this is a little bit extended. I'll get a couple people to read this. Maybe if I could get Renee to read verses 14 to 17, and then Ence, if you could read 18 through 21. So Renee, if you're able, if you could read 14 to 17.
Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver, and garments in great abundance. So also like the plague, or the plague will be the plague on the horse, the mule, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in the camp, and those camps. Then it will be come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and celebrate the feast of the booth. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them.
Verse 18 and following. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. In that day there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day.
Okay, so again, notice here what we've got. Again, a lot more details here than we're gonna deal with. But notice, okay, Judah will also fight. Then it will come about any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship who? the king,
King,
Yahweh of hosts, to celebrate the Feast of Booths, a Jewish holiday, and whichever families of the earth does not go up to where?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. To do what? To worship the king, Yahweh of hosts. There will be no rain on them. What's he describing here? Again, if we take a literal interpretive approach, what's he describing?
That Jerusalem will be like the very center of worship, that everybody will gather to that place to worship Yahweh.
Yeah, right? Gather in Jerusalem to worship the king, who in verse 9, it's Yahweh who's the king, right? So the peoples are going to be coming up from the nations, right? All who are left of the nations, the Gentiles, will come up to worship Yahweh in Jerusalem. And if they don't, they will suffer consequences for that. And that's reiterated in verse 18, right? If the family of Egypt, again, a Gentile, does not go up, no rain will fall on them. Okay, and so every cooking pot where in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to Yahweh. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them. There will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of. So what's this a picture of here? What's being described? I mean, how would we understand this if it wasn't literal? Is this the eternal state? I've seen some people describe it that way because they don't think of it as literal. No, this is not God reigning in Jerusalem, literally on the earth, and people coming. This is a picture of the eternal state. Well, what would you say to that?
There are still wicked people. There are still those who would not worship, who refuse to worship the king, and in the eternal state, it would be they would be in hell. Certain.
Yeah, we've got a problem. If this is the eternal state, you've got people that won't that aren't going to go to worship. And so consequences are described, right? So eternal state doesn't make any sense here. Clearly, this is talking about, a day in the future in the end. So they have to come up with some other day, I guess, to try to explain this if you don't take it literally, that this is saying literally, Yahweh will come defend Jerusalem after the nations have gathered. He will stand at the Mount of Olives. The land will be upheaved, and in that day he will defeat Israel's enemies, and he will reign as king from Jerusalem, where the peoples of the earth will come to offer him worship. And if they don't, there will be consequences for that. It's hard to see this any other way. Again, notice the literal references: Egypt, Jerusalem, the Feast of Booths, cooking pots in Jerusalem will be holy. All who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. There will no longer be a can. I mean, again, what are all these terms if it's not meant to, if this is not describing real actual events that are going to take place, then what is it a description of? And I don't mean to belabor or just repeat the same point over and over, but essentially that's what we're seeing in this text over and over. This idea is repeated of literal places, literal items, literal events taking place. And I think here we have a clear picture of when God returns and reigns on the earth. And of course, if we were to look at other prophetic texts in the Old Testament, we could make the connection and identify this as the Messiah. If you just go back to Daniel, Daniel 7, one like a son of man came up to the Ancient of Days, and to him was offered a kingdom, and he's called the king. So we could make connections going backwards, right? And be able to determine that this is referring to the Messiah, the one who represents God reigning on earth. Now, here in this text, Zechariah 14, that it's mentioned that Yahweh is the one who is the king, and that Yahweh's feet stand upon the Mount of Olives, and that Yahweh will reign from Jerusalem. So what does that tell us about the Messiah? The same guy. And now, of course, if we go ahead now and look at, Revelation 19, we're basically seeing Revelation 19 predicted here, Zechariah 14, right? Christ coming down from heaven and with his holy ones and coming down to earth and then fighting against the enemies, the nations that have gathered against Jerusalem, right? It's the same. Now, the horse isn't mentioned here in Zechariah as it is in Revelation 19, but there are many, many other similarities here. And then again, Revelation 20, what happens? 1,000-year reign. Here, the number 1,000 isn't mentioned in Zechariah, but certainly the reign of Messiah from Jerusalem is clearly indicated. And so here we have in this chapter very detailed, very specific description of the second coming. Though again, it's not as explicit here that it is the second coming of the Messiah. But again, if we piece together what we already have has already been revealed prophetically in Daniel and Isaiah, and even Joel and Micah, that we can piece together, this is that millennial kingdom, or at this time they wouldn't know it to be millennial. They would just say the kingdom. The kingdom is set up and the promise is fulfilled. The Messiah reigns from Jerusalem, and the nations come to worship him there. And then we notice too, in this kingdom, there will be rebels. Right? As Harris, you, and as Tabs, you pointed out, there's going to be people there who aren't going to worship the king. And so we have a picture here of unbelievers in the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, that is, not the eternal kingdom. And so this is describing a time period when Yahweh reigns on the earth. People come to him physically, literally, the nations come to him and reign. And notice it says there toward the end of the chapter, if you noticed, right, that the cooking pots, the bowls before the altar, that they will be holy, the bells on the horses, holy to the Lord. Why is that? Because Yahweh is there. So everything surrounding him is going to be holy. And again, notice, why mention cooking pots and bowls and bells of the horses? If those are symbolic of something, what do they symbolize? I mean, this is an interpretive nightmare if you try to look at this any other way than just say, no, it's literal. This is literal events, literal objects, literal places. that he's speaking of? Okay, I've done a lot of yapping here, a lot of talking. What do you guys think? What does that make sense to you, or are there questions there, or would you disagree? Do you have other
Pastor Team,
thoughts? Yeah, Tom.
uh, when we are looking at Zechariah, it shows that the event literally talks about the second coming of the Lord uh, and the setup of the millennial kingdom. My question is, what's the connection of the 45 days mentioned by Daniel prior to the setup of the kingdom?
Okay, good
Where
question.
where does that go or connected?
Well, here's what, again, now, this is just trying to bring other passages together. So now we're taking sort of the interpretive approach, because Daniel doesn't mention specifically. He just says, blessed is the one who attains to the 1,335 days. So what it appears to be is that there's 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, ending in Armageddon, ending in Zechariah 14, Revelation 19. Then there's another month which takes place, the 1,290 days, which some say that could be just sort of the what's called the mopping up activity. You know, there's going to be bodies everywhere. There's just going to, right, physically to remove and to deal with all of that. Could take a month, and then another 45 days for the society to be reset after this major cataclysmic. Again, remember all the things that have happened in the tribulation in Book of Revelation, right? It's just been devastation of the earth, just all kinds of destruction, and then it ends with this great battle around Jerusalem, where, right, the sheep and the goats, you know, right? God's enemies are destroyed. God's people are saved, delivered. So I think what many guys that I've seen just describe that after the 1,260 days, there's going to be some time that's required for sort of society to get reset and stable again. Just practically speaking, you could imagine, right? I mean, everything's wiped out. So just to rebuild, to reestablish. So I think what Daniel is saying is the one who makes it that 1335, those are the ones that come out of Armageddon, who are not, all of God's enemies in Armageddon are destroyed, Revelation 19 says. Everyone's killed. All the enemies are killed. So all who are left are believers. There's the believers who come down from heaven, the holy ones. And then there's believers who are still in their physical bodies, their non-resurrected bodies, who are still alive at the end of tribulation. So they enter the kingdom, because that's where all the humans come from in the kingdom. So the best guess that I have, or that I've seen, is those extra 30 and 45 days have to do with sort of society all the cleanup duty and everything, and then society sort of restabilizing again as the Lord then reigns from Jerusalem. So nobody knows specifically all the details, because it's not described anywhere really. Only that all God's enemies are defeated. Christ defeats all of his enemies, and that there's a 1,000-year reign, and Satan is bound. And then from Zechariah 14, we can see that there will be human beings alive during the millennial kingdom. Of course, we see that in Revelation 20 as well, which we're going to look at Revelation later. But we'll see there will be human beings that gather again at the end of the 1,000-year reign to try to attack the Messiah. So humans are going to be born, many humans, there'll be, for think about 1,000 years, that's a long time. So there'll be a lot of people on the earth at the end of those 1,000 years. And unfortunately, many unbelievers, even though Jesus is reigning literally from Jerusalem. I don't know if that answered your question, Natong. I mean, really,
Thank
the
you,
honest
Pastor.
the honest answer is nobody knows for sure. Best guess is that it's just additional time. Once Jesus has returned, there'll be additional time after that for things to sort of re-stabilize under that new order when Christ reigns on earth. People begin to reestablish their lives. I mean, imagine going through tribulation, the tribulation period, as a believer, and you survive. And then coming out of that, like what the state of the planet is going to be like at that point, and all that you've gone through and suffered. And it's hard to imagine. Let's see. Let me look up. Let's look up the answer key for all our Bible questions. The MacArthur Bible Commentary. What does he say? Tabs, you should know this. You're in seminary now. You should have this study Bible memorized. But yeah, let's see what he says about the text in Daniel. Daniel 12. 1,290 days. From the intrusion of the abomination, there follow 1,290 days. 1,260 make up the last 3.5 years of the final 7. Then 30 days more, possibly to allow for the judgment of the living subsequent to Christ's return before millennial kingdom blessings begin. This is in the kingdom that gives blessedness after subjecting Gentile empires. The 1,335 days, 45 more days, even beyond the 1,290 days, allows for the transition between Israel's time of being shattered and God setting up his kingdom. Okay, so I think I got it right then. So he's saying the same thing, basically for things to stabilize. But no one knows for sure because the details aren't necessarily given. Only what things look like in the millennial kingdom as far as Christ reigning and the people coming to worship, and what it looks like, at the end of the tribulation, Armageddon. But what happens between Christ's victory and that judgment, sheep-goat judgment, and the establishment of the millennial kingdom, what happens in that period between? That's what they say, well, that's where the 75 days of transition. Anyway, other thoughts or questions?
Pastor, you mentioned that those who will join the millennial kingdom are all believers from all nations.
Yeah, again, jumping ahead, Zechariah doesn't mention this explicitly, but right when Christ returns in Revelation 19, he defeats all of his enemies. So, but we know in the millennial kingdom, there will be human beings. So where do those people come from? I think those are the only way to explain that is, I believe that there are human beings who have not yet died at the end of the tribulation period, believers, because all of Christ's enemies are defeated, killed, but there will be believers who enter into the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, in their physical bodies, not the resurrected bodies of believers who have died or were raptured. That's in the group of holy ones that come down with him.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yeah, that's we'll look at that in more detail in future sessions when we get to Revelation 19 and 20. I want to spend a little time on those chapters since they provide so much detail and sequence of events of the end times. But we get a pretty good picture here in Zechariah, at least of the general key events at this time. And this is how Zechariah ends his book. And again, we want to keep in mind, all right, what's Zechariah doing? The first part of his book is a message to the people rebuilding the temple, and then 8 visions that he was given to encourage the people to rebuild. And then in chapters 9 to 14, he jumps ahead. This is after the temple was rebuilt. He gives these various prophecies of future events. And we have to ask, what's the relationship of those? Why does he put those with the visions? And he's written this book after the temple's built. So the purpose of this book was not to encourage the people to rebuild the temple. That was the purpose of the visions and the message that he wrote about in chapters 1 to 6. But these chapters 9 to 14 are Zechariah gives after the temple's built. So the purpose of the book is not exactly the same as the purpose of his original preaching ministry those first few years. So we have to think about then the purpose of the book is a little bit broader than just what happened what he said to encourage the people to rebuild the temple. There's more here. It's a broader theme. Think about, that, and then how it ends with the Messiah, the same one that was focused on in the visions, now reigning from Jerusalem, sort of to sort of wrap up the theme, really, I think, of Zechariah, the focus on Christ and his reign. Okay, well, so from this, we could see why the disciples had that expectation in Acts 1 when they asked Jesus, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Well, boy, you read Zechariah 14 and right, that makes sense why they would think that. Because that's exactly what's being said here, that the Messiah, Yahweh, will reign from Jerusalem, and the nations will come to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh. So the kingdom is established in Israel here. That's what a literal understanding of this passage would provide. And so that's one reason why the disciples would have that expectation. All right. Other questions, comments, cries of disbelief and agony?
Pastor Tim, what do you think of the Feast of Booths and the sacrifices?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to consider. It appears, and again, remember, the challenges here are, right, that God fulfilling promises to national Israel. And so there's that national Israel element here in the kingdom. The Messiah's reign on earth was really to bring to fulfillment the promises made to people of Israel in particular, that they would have a Messiah, a king who would reign in the land. And so we see here, and also in Ezekiel 40 to 48, elements of Jewish practices taking place in the millennial kingdom, such as Jewish celebrations like the Feast of Booths and the sacrifices that are mentioned here. And so that is one challenging element to consider is, okay, taking a literal approach, it seems like then there are certain Jewish practices which will be taking place. Now, obviously, the sacrifices which are made here are not going to be for forgiveness or salvation, but many believe maybe in a there's still others who sacrifice of thanksgiving, right? Other things that that could be brought as an expression of worship to the Lord. The Feast of Booths, there's nothing wrong with celebrating that. All that is it's a memorial of when God delivered the people and protected them in the desert, and they lived in these temporary tents, and God sustained them through that. And so, and also celebrating the harvest. So they're Jewish holidays, but there's nothing wrong with celebrating them. Even as Christians, we could celebrate those if we wanted, just as a memorial, a remembrance of God's work among his people in the past. So it appears on the surface to be maybe certain celebrations are brought about, particularly among the people of Israel. Let's see what, again, we'll look at the answer key here, see what Pastor John has to say about these things. Feast of Booths. The historical background can be found in Leviticus, Deuteronomy. In addition to the Feast of the Booths, 2 other feasts will be celebrated in the millennium. The Feast of the New Year, Ezekiel 45, the Feast of Passover, Ezekiel 45. These feasts are no more efficacious than were the Feast of the Mosaic era or the Lord's Supper in the church age. They all provide a symbolic anticipation or remembrance of Christ's unique once for all sacrifice at Calvary. So he's saying that there will be a celebration of these feasts, but not in the sense that they bring any spiritual what would be the right word? They're not salvific, just like the Mosaic covenant wasn't, but they would be done perhaps in the sort of a remembrance. Let me see what he says about the sacrifices, if anything. Let's see, that is in, where does it mention the sacrifices?
In 14, 19.
I know it's here, I just can't. Oh, here it is, 21, all who sacrifice. Yeah, he doesn't have any comment about that. He just have to look elsewhere to see what some others might say. It's a good question. And this is one that the people who don't believe in a literal kingdom, they bring up this point, like, hey, wait a minute, why are they going to offer sacrifices again? I mean, Jesus is the only one and only sacrifice once for all, right? So, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's a legitimate one, but we have to remember there's again a national flavor here, a focus on Israel and God's fulfillment of his promises to them. And so certainly some Israeli like events would not be unusual to me there. Again, the meaning and significance isn't going to be sacrifices for forgiveness of sins, but certainly I could see certain sacrifices being made as described in Ezekiel as a really a Jewish expression of worship that doesn't hold any salvation or spiritual The word's not coming to me. Would not have any relevance or effect in regards to salvation, but certainly could be done as expressions pointing to the Messiah and in worship of, or something like that. But that's the best I can offer you right now. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Thank you, Pastor Tim. It makes sense, Pastor. I think just like the Passover points backward and forward, it pointed backward to the deliverance of God in Egypt, and at the
Yeah.
same time forward to the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. So maybe the sacrifices would also point backward to the same sacrifice, the same deliverance that Jesus Christ offered. And I'm also thinking that if the millennialists would bring that up, they would also, I think, have a hard time also interpreting that event symbolically. So
Yeah.
thank you for your answer, Pastor King.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, good. Any other questions, comments before we end for the day? Okay. Well, Zechariah 14, the death knell of amillennialism. You've heard it here. Lord willing, next week we'll take a look, I think, at maybe the Olivet Discourse. Going to talk about that. And then in future weeks, maybe cover Revelation 19 and 20. Discuss some of those key chapters as well. And then I thought maybe after that, after looking at those passages, we could sort of dive into some of the eschatological views, the amillennial, premillennial, postmillennial, and just talk about some of those elements if you would like. So that's what I was thinking anyway. All right. Thank you for giving your time today. It's good to see you guys.
Thank you too, Pastor.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Brother Manny